Thank you, everybody. Hello, and welcome to Ruby like it's 1995. I'm Matias, and this is me on Twitter, that's me on GitHub, and that's me on the internet. You can see I have a great imagination when it comes to naming things. And I work for a software consultancy called Gisko Labs in Helsinki, Finland. And Rails is one of the main projects we use to get our work done. And in fact, we're pretty sure that no other company in Finland has done more Rails projects than we have. So as you can imagine, Ruby is pretty near and dear to our hearts. And to that end, we organized the Ruby meetup in Helsinki. We used to organize the Frozen Rails conference. We hosted the very first Rails Girls event ever. And next year, we're also bringing Yoroku to Helsinki, Finland. So if you're looking for another conference, that's a good choice. But back to Ruby itself now. Let's have a little show of hands here. What was your first version of Ruby? Was it 2 point something? All right, it's about a fifth or something. 1.9, about the same. 1.8, about the same again. Come on. 1.6. All right, we got two people there. Below 1.6. I have a presentation note here saying that you should shout out what version it was, but maybe we can skip that. So last year, I happened across this tweet from Mats, and it was Ruby's 25th birthday, at least according to Mats's reckoning, and who am I to argue? And that led me to consider the very early days of Ruby. So let's take a walk down memory lane. Cast your mind back to the year 1995. And sorry, that's not very 90s. Better. And the magic of VHS. And I guess some people here don't know what VHS is, but there we go. People were dressing something like this, or possibly like this. And Gangsta's Paradise is the top hit of the year. Followed by Staying Alive by and Kiss from a Rose. Oh yeah, and Batman Forward.
Love is a game.
What is it about the wrong kind of man?
It's the car, right? Chicks love the car.
And of course, Windows 95 is the hot new operating system.
Please welcome Bill Gates and the Bill Gates Dancers!
1995 was also a banner year for Microsoft. Windows 95 was introduced to great fanfare. Tonight Show host Jay Leno kicked off the ballyhoo for the new software.
Windows 95 is so easy, even a talk show host can figure it out.
And of course, Friends is the hottest show on TV. The combination of which leads to this awesome video.
There are 4 things you ought to know about Windows 95. It's easier, it's faster, it's more powerful, and it's got great compatibility. Now, point the mouse at the start button, bottom left, and click. Look, Maddie, I'm computing.
Look, Matty, I'm computing. And of course, Toy Story is the box office hit of the year.
This holiday season, the adventure takes on when toys come to life. To infinity and beyond! Toy Story.
And of course, as I'm sure everybody here knows, Finland wins the World Ice Hockey Championship for the first time. And I'd just turned 9 years old. And finally, in December, Mats publishes Ruby 0.95, the very first public release of Ruby. And if we look at the features listed in the announcement, it looks quite a lot like Ruby. You have variables that aren't explicitly typed. Scopes are defined by the variable name. It's object-oriented. There's operator overloading. There's exception handling. There's iterators and closures and a garbage collector. And yeah, it looks like Ruby. And there's a nice little hello world program in there using print because puts does not exist. And at some point, I realized you could still go download the source code for Ruby 0.95. So that led me to this question. Could I still run Ruby 0.95? I mean, how hard could it possibly be? It's just a relatively small amount of C code, and 1995 wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm sure we got Ruby 2.6 in last December, and then 2.5, 2.4, Rails 5 in there, 2.3, 2.2, 2.1, Rails 4, Rails 2.0 back in 2013, Rails 1.9 and there, 2.0, Rails 1, Ruby 1.8 in 2003, 1.6 in the year 2000, 1.4 in 99, 1.2 in 99 as well, 1.0 in 97, and finally 0.95 in 95. And apologies to anybody in the back row. It turns out it's actually quite hard to fit 25 years into a slide. And before we go deeper in, we can take a little look at the sort of numbers of how these compare. Download size, Ruby 0.95, 300 kilobytes, and Ruby 2.6, about 16 megabytes. It's been a sort of slow and steady rise in download size. Number of files, about 158 files in Ruby 0.95, and about 10,000 in Ruby 2.6. But hey, at least modern versions of Ruby have more Ruby than C code. And in fact, Ruby 2.6 has more lines of make files than Ruby 0.95 had lines of Ruby. Well, and there's a documentation which was listed as being poor in the release announcement. Well, what there is in Japanese. Which really leads me to problem number one. I don't speak Japanese. And it also turns out that compiling 20-year-old code is not exactly easy. But hey, my first try, just download it and compile it. See what happens. Unfortunately, not on Mac OS, because Mac OS, or OS 10 as it was known back in the day, was released 6 years after Ruby 0.95. Right? But that's not a problem. We'll just use Linux. But we also can't use 64-bit Linux, because that wasn't really a thing in 95. But that's also not really that big of a problem. We'll just use a 32-bit Linux. So not really a big problem. I'll just use a virtual machine. Unfortunately, you also can't use a modern version of Linux, because a modern version of Linux means it has modern compilers. And that turns out to be fairly important. And let's take a little look at the Ruby 0.95 source code to see one of the issues. So the last line there is a really important thing here. And to understand what's wrong there, we need to look at GCC itself. And just as a quick aside, if you don't know what GCC is, it's the GNU compiler collection. And it supports compiling a whole bunch of different languages, but most importantly for us, it compiles C code. So back to where we were earlier. We were looking at this line there, the include var args.h. And to understand why that breaks, we need to look at GCC's source code itself. Var args was the way, past tense, that C functions could take variable numbers of arguments. And as you can imagine, that's pretty important for a language like Ruby. However, var args.h no longer exists. And in fact, it was removed 17 years ago. Yeah. But hey, at least now we know that we need a version of GCC that was released before July 2002. So theoretically, 3.1 or less should do. No problem. We'll just compile GCC 3.1. So who wants to guess what happens when you try to compile a 17-year-old version of GCC on a modern Linux?
Computer says no.
Computer does say no. Yeah. And arguably, this is where the descent into madness begins. Maybe I could just use a really old version of Debian. I mean, it's been around forever, and I think I mostly know how to use it. And what's more, Debian 3.0 Woody shipped with GCC 2.95.4, so it should at least have that var args implementation. But it turns out that my Linux skills would be no good 20 years ago. I mostly couldn't even get packages installed. And can you believe that the package mirrors for Debian 3.0 are dead? Oh, and it also doesn't support HTTP apt mirrors, so anything new also is unusable. But how about we use a whole chain of GCC? I take the oldest GCC I can use that to compile a slightly older version of GCC, and keep going until everything works. At which point, I find a tool called the Bootstrap, or possibly the Bootstrap, I'm not quite sure. And it's a tool that you can use to install a Debian-based system onto an already installed system. The important thing being that you don't need to run a whole big virtual machine. You just install it in a chroot. And the documentation doesn't tell you how to pronounce the Bootstrap, so I'm just guessing here. So here's the plan. I get a fairly old version of Ubuntu, 12.04, 32-bit. I use that to create a Dapper Drake environment from 2006. I use the GCC 3.3 from Dapper to compile GCC 2.8.1. And Ruby still refuses to compile. Right, so we'll compile GCC 2.7.2 using 2.8.1, and that also fails for some reason, which leads to this. So after taking a moment to just calm down, and after deciding that Sam Phippen is right, computers are bad, think, okay, let's recap. Problems, we have lots. Number one, can't read Japanese. Number two, can't use macOS. Number three, can't use a 64-bit system. Number four, can't use a modern compiler. Number five, you can't compile an old compiler using a modern compiler. Well, the first three are quite easy to learn, fix. It's too late to learn Japanese now. Just give up on that. Just use Linux instead of macOS, it's fine. Can't use a 64-bit system, use a 32-bit system. So if we could just get rid of problem number four, it would rather handily also solve problem number five. So frack it. I'm going on an adventure. I'll just fix the C code myself. Except that, did I mention that I don't know C? I think that's problem number 6 if we're counting. But how hard could it be? We can start with the problem that we already know about, which is this varargs.h thing. And what we need to do is, after Googling for a bit, we need to replace this header up there with the new implementation, this standard arg. Replace up there, and then update the function definition, and then also change this va start call to take that second argument. And then we need to make those changes here as well, and there. And also, I end up backporting some fixes from Ruby 1.1 and change the va starts there, and also there, and there. And then, I also have to update the headers because this changes the interface. And then I make some other random fixes that I don't really understand, but the compiler keeps giving me errors. And some more fixes I don't really understand. And then for some reason we need to include that there. Oh yeah, and I also end up butchering the script that compiles native extensions for Ruby. And when I say butcher, I mean it. That might be a bit hard to make out, so here's the full diff. But who needs sockets anyways? And remember that release announcement from earlier? It turns out I should have read it a little bit more carefully, because Mats followed up on that same day with a patch to array.c. And there is always something wrong, which I think is a slogan for software development. And most importantly, the Ruby 095 source code does not include this patch. So I go ahead and apply that patch as well, and then we're just about ready for the million-dollar question. Does it compile? Yes, it does. We have a binary. It runs. You get a nice version string there. But does it run Ruby? Yes, it does. There's no IRB, so we just echo stuff into the binary through standard input. But it runs it, and it prints. And as I said, you can't use puts because it doesn't exist. And you can even run some of the samples included in Ruby 095. For example, this one that lists the files in the directory. There are some caveats, though. It segfaults if you look at it wrong. A lot of things are strange or missing, at least to our sort of modern Ruby eyes. Instead, there's no puts. There's no HTTP, and that would be true even if I hadn't discarded socket support. There are no date or datetime classes. You do get a time class, though. No IRB. No threads. So if you regret adding them, you're in luck. And then some things that are a little bit weird, like true and false are written in all caps. Class inheritance looks like this. And as far as I could tell, they would change the angle brackets in 0.99. Matt is nodding, so I hope that means it's true. And there's a whole separate module for parsing dates. And it assumes that the years are 2 digits and that the dates are in the 20th century. But the main point is that it lives, even if it is in a sort of undead way. So what could we do with this next? Well, for one thing, Matt's left behind a to-do list. So you could follow that along, just cross out the thread support. So if you disagree with how things have gone since Ruby 095, just start from here. You could use something like GDB to debug why it keeps segfaulting, and in fact, I tried to, but I also don't know how to use GDB, and I couldn't get it to give me an actual backtrace, no matter what I tried. So, obviously. However, somebody might guess what's coming. I did manage to make a Docker image. So if you can run all your sweet Ruby 0.95 code now with Docker. That's as long as it doesn't segfault. But really, you should just go back to using Ruby 2.6. It practically never segfaults. Or then use mruby if you actually need a very small Ruby. You could also probably draw some conclusions about the longevity of software and possibly about the futility of all human endeavor. But seriously, someone please fix those segfaults for me. They're really bugging me. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. The source code is on GitHub. I mean, my modified source code, so if you want to submit a PR, go ahead. And if you have any questions later, I'm on Twitter.
All right, that's good. Let's give Matias a big hand again. So thank you so much for taking us back to 1995. So now, anyone want to share your stories with Matias or any questions for him? Please raise your hands. All right.
Did you do this during work hours?
No comment. No, I didn't. I did this in my free time. I would like to point out that at Gisk Labs, we do not use Ruby 0.95 in production.
So how long you spend time on this project?
I haven't really kept count, but in the end, it's surprisingly little. But it's spread out, so it's hard to say.
Yes.
Well, not really. I mean, it segfaults very easily. I need to stress this a lot. It's probably not Matt's fault, and it wasn't meant to be, knifed in the back by somebody who doesn't know C code.
Anyone else? Okay, let me check. Yes.
Well, first of all, I learned that despite us having this rich history of we have all the source code, we have all this code from not that long ago, and it's only 2 decades. I mean, the Matrix would come out 4 years after this. It was not that long ago, and yet I can't get it to work now. So I just wonder how much stuff are we basically losing along the way here inadvertently.
Questions? No? Okay. Thank you, Matias.